Welcome, everyone. I'm really sorry for that delay. We just had some technical issues, but welcome to our online webinar, Rethinking Resilience, Social Reconstruction in Iraq and Ukraine. This is hosted by the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy Trends Research Program, otherwise known as XCEPT, in conjunction with the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation and the Department of War Studies here at King's. I'm Dr. Craig Larkin. I'm a reader in Middle East politics and peace and conflict studies, co-director of the Centre for the Study of Divided Societies at KCL, and research lead on memory and conflict for the XCEPT consortium. This is our second of a two-part series looking at 2 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In that time, Ukraine has suffered devastating losses, seeing the destruction of its vibrant communities, witnessed widespread damage to its critical infrastructure. We don't know exactly what the future will hold for Ukraine, but steps are already underway to lay foundations for a successful post-conflict recovery. In Iraq, communities are still rebuilding and coming together after 2 decades of violent conflict. The recovery process is well underway. In this webinar today, we will consider whether Ukraine can learn lessons from the recovery process, which is currently ongoing in Iraq, how the international community can best support inclusive reconstruction, and how experiences during the course of a conflict might shape attitudes towards reconciliation in a post-conflict society. Yesterday and today's events are being held under the theme of rethinking resilience. Resilience has become the go-to term for post-conflict recovery. We talk about resilient cities, resilient communities, resilient societies. It's oft used, but very poorly defined or explored. Resilience may be the ability to withstand, endure, or return to the original state. But successful reconstruction in post-war society does not necessarily mean returning to the status quo. So we're here to learn about what successful reconstruction can actually look like. Joining us today to discuss these themes are Dr. Rudolf and Olga Kotiuk. Dr. Rudolf is a senior research fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation, postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for the Study of Divided Societies. Within the XCEPT consortium, she is analysing the implications of identity politics and the mobilisation of violent memories. Olga Kotiuk is an armed conflict and peace-building expert with 13 years of experience with non-profit government and research. She has extensive experience mitigating the consequences of the Russian war against Ukraine, working with conflict-affected communities in the east of Ukraine. Currently, Olga is leading the transitional justice and cultural work streams in the Partnership Fund for Resilient Ukraine. So today's format, Inna and Olga will start by giving us an overview of the current situation in both Iraq and Ukraine. Then they will explore key themes related to social reconstruction, the role of the international and local community, memory, heritage, and identity, and then go on to talk about best practice. After the presentations, we'll turn to a Q&A session. So you can ask questions throughout the talks by using the Q&A function on Zoom. So please feel free to submit this at any time, and at the end of the event, we will come back to them. I should say that this event is being recorded, and yesterday's event on men and conflict trauma will be available to view afterwards online. Before I quickly hand over to Inna, I want to give you a brief background on XCEPT. XCEPT is a multi-year research program funded by UK International Development, which is exploring the cross-border dimensions of conflict and the drivers of violence and peaceful behaviour, with a view to inform policy responses that can support a sustainable peace. The research component that we're carrying out at King's is focused on understanding more about what drives violent and peaceful behaviour. We're an interdisciplinary team bringing together experts in war, neuroscience, memory, psychology, trauma, and terrorism. Today's discussion is building on research Inna and I've been carrying out in Iraq as part of the XCEPT research programme, which has been looking at reconciliation, construction, and rebuilding. So without further ado, I'll hand over to first Inna and then Olga. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Craig, for this introduction. And as mentioned by you, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to share with you some lessons from our research on post-conflict recovery in Iraq. And today I would be specifically sharing with you insights from our last round of field work in Nineveh and in Mosul. And I hope really that some of the lessons can be beneficial for our colleagues in Ukraine. So let me begin by saying that despite having worked for over 10 years on Iraq and visited the country multiple times, witnessing the extent of destruction 10 years after the ISIS invasion of Mosul left me deeply affected. 80% of the old city has been destroyed. 47 architectural sites have been also deliberately destroyed. A devastating herbicide and a deliberate attempt to annihilate the spirit of the city. As affected as I was witnessing in person the extent of the destruction, the more amazed I was by the local communities, by their incredible spirit, by their resilience, as you mentioned, though not in the classic sense of the words, that they still manage every day not to lose hope, not to lose their optimism, that working and clearing the rubble card by card can indeed contribute to improving their lives. Local activists, supported more often by local philanthropists rather than central government representatives, have worked relentlessly to salvage, to resurrect the spirit of their city and also its cosmopolitan legacy. And there, amidst the ruins, if we can go now to the next slide. The next slide, please. Thank you. So amidst the ruins, you would witness lovingly restored heritage museums and community centers with amazing grassroots-led volunteer work. Instead of drowning in traumatic memories of the past, many have sought refuge, identity, and purpose in reviving the city's ancient multicultural legacy. Now, supporting these efforts on the ground does not mean that we should conceal uncomfortable and chronically suppressed facts. Mosul and especially Nineveh's province, inner and intra-communal tensions, as well as feelings of alienation vis-a-vis the state, have been growing and accumulating long before the ISIS invasion in 2014. Therefore, to prevent history from repeating itself, one should deal but also confront these pre-ISIS grievances. Many agree that only by remembering the past can the past indeed remain as past. But addressing all of this, I would say, insufficiently digested historical periods, one should not go and push for a very ambitious process without proper preparation, because this would risk re-traumatizing these communities. The social fabric and its diverse components have witnessed so much destruction, so much stigmatization. They have been exposed to competing victimhood narratives. I think this last picture very much illustrates the circumstances to which these different components of the social fabric have been waking up every day. And still not giving up their hope, not stopping to work for the recovery of their beloved city. That's why what we owe to these communities is pushing for a more inclusive and incremental process that would allow all of these different communities coming around the table, but coming together around a shared pride in their history. And this is what we have been witnessing during our last visit to the city and the province. And now I would like to give the words to Olga.
Thank you, Ina. Good afternoon, everyone. If I correct, it's afternoon. So, big honor to be here, and I really want today share from more practical perspective of what does it mean to do the social reconstruction, social recovery in ongoing war. So here in this slide is just like a brief snapshot of what is happening on the north of Ukraine in Chernihiv region. That's the cultural sites, heritage sites, Chernihiv Dram Theater that was damaged by Russian shellings, and it's just a little part of the all destruction that is happening on the permanent, constant basis. And Ukraine is currently living in the ongoing catastrophe that is unpredictable and keep on moving. Can we go to the next slide? So I would focus on like several main things to describe the situation in which we are working now. Can we change the slide, please? So me and my colleagues who are working in Ukraine with the topic of memorialization and identity building and reshaping, since 2022, early days of full-scale invasion, we were discussing lately the changing our approach and vision of the situation. If we are talking about social reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, the key thing is post-war. And now, after 2 years of full-scale invasion and actually 10th anniversary, very soon it will be 10th anniversary of Russian war against Ukraine, we are facing the need of reshaping the approach and to talk about how can we support population and contribute to building resilience in conflict, during conflict with which we cannot prognose when will be ended. But to give an overview of the situation in the memory sphere and society before the conflict, I would say that we have to face the legacy of Soviet Ukraine culture and memory infrastructure. And that means that we, before 2014 and before 2018, we have like old Soviet cultural infrastructure on the community level that lacked capacity and quality standards. We have a very creative, lively environment of cultural entrepreneurs, creative industries, as well as good community of highly qualitative scientists who studied memory in different ways. But overall, there was like a low priority of culture in state strategy at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022. The cultural perspective and memorialization issues were not prioritized by government in the peace plan, but through the living through the war, society requested the grassroots need to actually to commemorate this ongoing tragedy that is happening to almost all Ukrainians. Yeah, and for now, as the battlefield dynamics is changing, as the front line is changed a lot in 2022 and not as much in 2023, but the internal migration process influences the dynamic on memory work and changing identity a lot. So a lot of the representatives of professional industry faces the need of working with changed audiences as a big volume of IDPs now spread around the country on the governmentally controlled territories, and that demands a lot of creative approaches of how to engage with a new audience. And as you see, Ukraine is a huge country and with multifaceted identities on the local level that contribute to overarching Ukrainian identity. But despite other downsides, I would say in our circumstances, like brain drain, like cultural sphere, general depressive outlook of the current situation, we have like some positive dynamics, and in crisis there are a lot of resources that that people can use. Can we go to next slide? And surprisingly or not, over the last 2 years, the society explores a lot of new resources, as I said. And for example, the war crisis actually kick off this grassroots request for learning Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, studying the language and getting back to the cultural roots. Actually, that's ignite the real deep interest to Ukrainian culture among Ukrainian population with different backgrounds. The war also explores like huge creative potential that that now resulted in a lot of projects, movies, documentaries, arts exhibition that reflects on the war experience in day-to-day life. For example, yesterday, 2 days ago, Ukrainian documentary 20 Days in Mariupol received BAFTA awards for best documentary, and that's basically the documentation of war per se. The other good background that's the background process that we have now is the society is doing inclusive and open dialogue about what are we doing with the legacy and heritage of Soviet and Russian Empire history that we all share. How do we rethink the identity, and what are we doing with Ukrainian culture heritage, and how can we reappropriate it back? But it's not a blind, straightforward process. It's really important that society is like organically produce this space for open dialogue about that. And also cultural institutions and memory sites, institutions that they open like a lot of flexibility and adaptability in times of war, because every day you don't know if your cultural site and institution will be safe after the shelling, but you have to continue your operations. So a lot of like creative potential hidden and being revealed over last 2 years. Yeah. Over to Craig, I believe.
Ina, could you continue on the, and now go look at the international and local?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when we discuss the international and the local dimension, it's very important to stress that the two are not mutually exclusive and should not be measured against each other. They are complementary, and I would say each set of these actors has its own strengths, but each can also do better by learning how to leverage each other's strengths. Now, if we can jump to the next slide. The next one, please. Let us start with the international dimension. I would say that both in the field of so-called peace building and reconciliation, as well as in the field of heritage promotion, there is still a strong sense of appreciation for the efforts, but also for the presence on the ground of these actors. Especially the UNESCO flagship project, Reviving the Spirit of Mosul, has been really seen by locals as something tangibly improving realities on the ground. Now, many have praised the investments, the engagement of UNESCO in restoring emblematic heritage sites such as the Nuri Mosque, Sa, and Tahara Church. But still, we should talk also about certain miscalculations and about room for improvement. For the beginning, we encountered some criticism regarding the initial designs that were approved by UNESCO for the rebuilding of the Nuri Mosque. And these local voices criticized that the sketches did not necessarily reflect the original character of their mosque. So what they were longing for was getting their old mosque back, like with all of the old memories connected to it. Another point of criticism was about the nature of the spending. Now, some argued that with the funds provided by UAE, one could have easily restored 10 mosques and heritage sites with the scale of Al-Nuri. Now, beyond the technicality of these questions, what matters most actually for international interventions to thrive and to convince recipients are perceptions. How are these interventions seen in the eyes of local communities? For instance, even if local experts have been engaged in multiple stages of designing, conceptualizing the project, if this has not been communicated sufficiently, then these interventions will still appear as foreign, as something that might occasionally backlash or have an alienating effect. And the same goes for the field of peace building and reconciliation. Sometimes even the smartest interventions with the most robust theory of change would not achieve its full potential if local recipients do not feel necessarily engaged and informed about questions such as, why are we doing this? And by strategic communication, I don't just mean beautiful posts on social media about events, about gatherings, including a lot of culture, music, children in the background, but really communicating to local communities the strategic rationale. For instance, why are we investing money to make you talk with your neighbor about some very traumatizing events instead of, for example, building you a hospital or a mental health clinic or a cars factory? I don't mean to be sarcastic here, but to make peace and reconciliation initiatives, especially those which are foreign sponsored, to work, you have to sell them properly, and you have also to communicate them against the background of multiple corruption scandals, mushrooming NGO projects with no clear start and ending date. So those questions being raised by local voices are legitimate. And I think the Western jargon of peace building, of reconciliation, is sometimes a bit too abstract, too vague, and too foreign to convince potential participants in the long-term vision of this project. If we can now go to the previous slide, I'm sorry. This statue actually shows whom local communities view as the main contributor to rebuilding their city, and those are the local workers, those who did not shy away from the rubble, from the landmines that were being encountered on a daily basis, those who literally were doing the heavy lifting. And if international interventions are to thrive, they have to do a better job in identifying and empowering exactly these locally embedded heavy lifters. Another recommendation that we have also on behalf of these local communities is for the international organizations to leverage even better their influence vis-a-vis the central government, vis-a-vis state officials, to do more to embrace these local champions, to empower them, to engage with them at a regular basis instead of stigmatizing or excluding them. And here it's very important that the international community should do this in a way that incentivizes the government to go back to the driver's seat, and also to be seen by local communities as being in this driver's seat. Now, this would require, let's say, the PR strategies of international organizations to sometimes refrain from claiming too much credit for their contributions on the ground, because at the end of the day, post-conflict stabilization and the restoring of social cohesion in these conflict-affected areas is also about restoring the trust of these communities in their own government, in their own state. Thank you.
Thank you, Ina, for your insights, and I pretty much echoing what you are saying about giving the community opportunity to be in a driver's seat. And to compare it to Ukrainian situation, I believe a lot of conclusions that you've made are still relevant, with that only comment that we cannot talk about peace building and reconciliation. I will get back to this, reframing the understanding of Ukrainian context and working with memory and culture during the war. So in terms of we still cannot say about peace and reconciliation, probably taking into account the outcry for justice in Ukrainian society, we won't be able to talk about peace before the acute stage of war is over and the justice is brought based on the recent surveys. So first justice, then peace. But reconciliation for Ukrainians now means more to reconcile and to deal with our own past. And here I'm now talking not as a PFRU professional only, but also as a Ukrainian citizen. So in these realities, it's really interesting how international partners are joining the efforts of building collective memory and preserving the heritage of Ukraine. So during conflict, we have a lot, several big funds, international players who rushed to Ukraine aiming to preserve the heritage that was not destroyed, but and also to conservate the heritage sites that was like destroyed in the course of war. So there is a division of responsibilities, I would say, that international actors paying attention more to preserving the UNESCO heritage sites, big sites, big institutions, and focus more on that hard sides of heritage preservation. On the national level, the government is really has a lot of constraints with investing and into memory work, both as fostering cultural work as well, due to the economy of war is limits the resources of government with all of the budgets going to the defense. But at the same time, on the national level, national actors are doing, not the governmental ones, but sort of governmental ones, like big institutions like Mistecki Arsenal, big museums on the in South Ukraine and in the East as well. They have a lot of influence and this capacity to share experience and set the tone of the discussion about memorialization of the current war, addressing the traumas of the past of Russian Empire regime, Soviet regime, and rethinking the narratives that was spreaded by a Russian Federation in the course of hybrid war. So on the national level, there are a lot of opportunities for international actors to support that regional and national cultural institutions who can lead the transformation in the society and who can lead this feed to the public discussion about what Ukrainian identity is and how it's reshaping in terms of war. And coming back to the work that we are doing on the ground, we decide to stress and to focus on the community work and strengthening decentralization of memorialization. That's how the work is shaped, and the work on the grassroots level in communities that were newly deoccupied gives a lot of fruitful results because people are the experts. They live through this experience of being under occupation, of surviving the Russian rule that may be in their community for like 3 weeks, 6 weeks to 6 months to 6 years. So it's like a variety of different people's expertise that actually shapes how memory is designed today. So I would say that supporting for international partners and for national Ukrainian agents who are working with memory, it's really important to support national projects and build the capacity and network of smaller institutions and empower local artists, incentivize them to stay in the country regardless of the constraints, give the resources to the national level, and also give the support to like very small communities that's literally now situated on the front line because they are creative the memory and create the collective memory culture, being on the front line in South and in East of Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just going to jump in here. The very title of the slide, Memory, Heritage, Identity in the Iraqi context, is basically treading a minefield. So who gets to decide what is to be remembered and how? Especially contradictory portrayals of certain historical episodes are being constantly rewritten in school books from one regime to the other. And also, who gets to determine what should be suppressed for the sake of avoiding re-traumatization? And lastly, how can we make sure that those in charge of promoting, of imposing a certain dominant narrative about historical events and also reconciling conflicting perceptions of the past are not doing so in order to secure their own stakes in the post-conflict economy? So all of those are very relevant questions in the Iraqi context, and the answers are still vague. The right to frame who is a victim and who is the perpetrator, who belongs to a community of perpetrators, has been regularly abused in myriad post-conflict societies. And as a result, those who end up being most affected often seek refuge and healing and meaning and even purpose in the past, in nostalgia. So basically craving for an imaginary past that gives them this feeling of belonging to something more honorable, to something beautiful. So the question here is, if we think about policy implications, how can we make this romanticization of the past work? How can we leverage it? Now, there are many impressive heritage projects in the Iraqi context that have discovered that by bringing communities together around, as I mentioned earlier, around a shared pride in their legacy, can help them come closer, can help them encounter each other as humans again, as actually the successors of this proud culture, which also comes with great responsibilities. So in the long run, the theory of change behind these projects is that this would help members of rival communities even connect to each other and empathize with each other's very specific victimhoods and experiences of stigmatization, of discrimination, even before the beginning of the war against ISIS. If we can now jump to the next quote, to the next slide. Since 2005, the city of Mosul meant nothing to me. I hated, loathed, detested it. I lost so many friends in the city. I tried to stay away from it. The night of its downfall in 2014, I cried hysterically until the morning before. I felt for the first time I belonged to the city, but at the same time I had lost the city. As this quote shows, actually, the feeling of having almost lost one's home, one city, has urged many to overcome their disillusionment before the beginning of the conflicts, before the beginning of the violent episodes, and be an active part in rebuilding the city, be an active part in reviving its former glory. And this has indeed completely revolutionized the local activist scene, but I will talk more about that when we discuss the best practices. If we can now jump to the next slide. A contentious point, a still very much unresolved point, remains the question what to do with the so-called dark heritage, with sites associated with trauma, with horrific violence, with atrocities, as is the case, as we can see here in the picture. This is a picture of the Al-Zinjili Pepsi factory, where one of the most atrocious crimes of ISIS occurred, where 84 Maslawis women and children were killed by ISIS snipers. Now, to honor the victims, local families had took the initiative in their own hands, and they had put this mural, which you can see on the right side, listing the names of the victims, of the women and children killed in this massacre. And despite having numerous sites in and around Mosul associated with this kind of atrocities, Zinjili remains one of the very few where we have witnessed at least an attempted memorialization. And why is that? Memorials against the background of these contradictory perceptions of the past are still regarded as a double-edged sword. Now, some advocate that it's very important, it's a necessity to establish war memorials, to remind future generations of what had happened, and to even, as one of the interviewees said, to vaccinate them against extremist propaganda. But others are just disillusioned, they are tired, and they argue that for their psychological healing process, they just need a clean break with the past. They want to open a new page, and they rejoice whenever they witness a new building being reconstructed and kind of like having all of these beautiful new architectural developments, reclaiming the space and erasing the memories, the scars of the conflict. Now, overall, these contradictions showcase that what is needed right now, more than the actual push for the creation of memorials as facts on the ground, is a more inclusive and incremental dialogue process, a process which can determine how each community, like what kind of approach each community would prefer to memorialize what has happened, to honor their victims, but also to reconcile with the past. And until this phase is over, it would be too soon to come up with plans for a unified approach to memorialization and to kind of like already putting a very materialized version of interpretations what has happened during the conflict with ISIS. The next phase would then require a participation from the side of the national government to reconcile all of these different perceptions, all of these different victimhoods under a common narrative, but a narrative where no one feels as victor or vanquished. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ina. A lot of what you're talking about is needed to be addressed in Iraq, actually, on the personal level, applicable in Ukraine, and there are a lot of parallel processes that is happening now, but constantly will remind us that we're still in an acute stage of war, in ongoing war, and we are living in a kind of in Ukraine in a situation when everything is happening at once, and a lot of multi-layered processes is happening. Like, first of all, Ukrainian identity is being targeted in this war. And as it was discussed the other week at the Munich Security Conference, at one of the panel, that actually identity and like separate Ukrainian identity is actually one of the root causes of this existential war, only due to the existence Ukrainian nation is being targeted. And that's a very interesting moment for Ukrainian population to rethink what this identity is, actually. I would say that first, the memorialization processes now is process is covering what is happening during this war. The atrocities during the occupation, the wrongdoings and war crimes of Russian soldiers are being memorialized, commemorated in a very organic way by people who are living in community. There is like this very, very instant demand to put the memorial for soldiers who defended the city, to do some sort of memorial site or a plaque, just to witness that these events, these tragic and atrocious events happened in the city. But these community-based and personal processes are very, very ad hoc and basically very chaotic and organic, which where is rooted the beauty of it. So at the national level, at the same time, there is like process of that's rooted in this like inclusive dialogue of what shall we remember and how can we remember, not only limit and the timeline not only limited to beginning of full-scale invasion and this time being, but it's also referring to the stage of war between 2014 and 2022. How do we remember this time of war? And actually, if we're now talking on overarching processes, there is a big question of how do we frame memorialization as a one pillar of transitional justice, and what is transitional justice mean for Ukraine? Because over 30 years of Ukrainian independence, we, like, not government, not society, basically addressed the issue of Soviet regime crimes and wrongdoings, including Gulag, including artificial famine known as Holodomor. And Ukrainians during the independent time never addressed the heritage of Russian Empire. So on the governmental level, they're framed two laws, overarching laws about that's kind of given the direction of the memory work on the ground. First is decommunization, second is decolonization. Now that's the legal framework that reflects people grassroots demand for justice that we are living in. So basically, if we're talking about the practical, in the practical terms, we are working in our program on the grassroots memory work and creating the collective memory work culture. Documenting on what is happening right now, not only the war crimes, but also the whole variety of the war experiences that people on the front line living through and people in the rear is living through. There are myriads of different everyday life war experiences that matters, and that's one layer. And also, when we are working with, for example, NGOs or cultural institutions on the regional or national level, we cannot escape engaging with the decommunization and decolonization topics, because it's like the memory is not only working with the past, but it's also a way of the tool that's creating future. So working with the current war experiences and documenting every like personal experiences of war, people cannot escape questioning what's happening in the past and how their family were targeted for first by Soviet Empire, and if people are thinking and reflecting, that's what we see in communities. For example, in Chernihiv region on the north, like regular people, like from the village, who lived through occupation, they're basically asking the questions, but my grandfather also lived through this through war. My grandfather actually was killed by white guards fighting for Ukrainian statehood in the beginning of the 20th century. So it's all happening at once. But can we please go to the next slide? But I want to illustrate what the people's reaction, the society reaction to war. For example, I want to take like very tragic pictures from the vanished from the surface of first cities on the front line in the east, like Bakhmut or Mariupol, but I will illustrate how people react to and work with heritage sporadic, like very organically in the face of war. So this is Odessa, and that's how usually people, regular citizens, protect the monuments. And this is the monument for the founder of Odessa, French noble man known as Duke. And can we go to the next slide briefly? And this is an example of people's reaction to and people's demands to decolonize themselves. This is the monument of Catherine II in the city of Odessa. And that's basically what happened over one night during at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. People just handed the leash and marking Catherine II, the Russian emperor, as a criminal. Can we go to the next slide to see the evolution of people, public sayings? So over the next months, people were constantly continuing this dialogue. So like you can say that it's like vandalization, but that's you cannot prevent people from doing their sayings, and that's I'm stressing that also was very organic. Can we go to the next one? Several months ago, so this is the government who just put her in protective materials to keep away from vandalization. But the next months happened the dismantling of this monument. And can we go to the next one? Yeah, so it was this monument of Catherine was officially dismantled, but the story hasn't ended over there. The question is, what shall Ukrainians now do with this monument? Shall we utilize it somehow? Shall we just put it in some sort of the museum? The dialogue is open, and it's happening as the severe battles are happening at the front line. The next. So basically, local Odessa National Museum take this monument to their yard, not to protect it, not to preserve it, but as an invitation to discussion, as a pause in this sentence, that we do not have to make it, we don't have to make a decision right now. What are we doing with this country? And because it's a process of like fundamental shifting of identity and rethinking the legacy of two regimes that's associated with Russia. And can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so the monument was lying in the yard of Odessa Museum. Next, for several weeks. Then the museum workers, the team built a cover to cover Catherine the Great, just not to trigger people who were visiting the museum, because it's really traumatizing and triggering during the shellings, during constant bombardments of the cities. People can see the monument and question, why are we trying to keep this statue of the country that is targeting us? Next. And the last autumn, the museum were targeted and was badly damaged during the shellings of Odessa. Next, Catherine survived. Next one. And here you see the discussion that is happening in the territory of Odessa Museum, and citizens basically saying their opinion how we should go about both this very statue of Catherine the Great and the heritage of Russian Empire as well. Next. And that's Catherine in the box, waiting for what's happening next and how society would decide what shall we do with this decolonization processes. Yeah, so that's the story. We are continuing to follow the chronicles of Catherine II, and it's like very illustrative to what is happening with the society in war right now, dealing with everyday tragedy and at the same time like addressing the fundamental questions of de-imperialization, decolonization, and rethinking how, but not blindly, but continuing very inclusive and thoughtful dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you, Olga. Indeed, a very controversial discussion that you summarized here. So in contrast to that, I would be speaking about the Iraqi best practices, which supposedly very deliberately so, have steered away from divisive issues, from, let's say, controversial historical figures, but have generated legitimacy and credibility and also success on the ground by bringing people together around a shared issue, a shared cause, a shared pride in something. So I would like to speak about 3 different examples of best practices, and all of them are more grassroots oriented, locally led, and not part, let's say, of this larger UNESCO, USAID cosmology. So the first one are the so-called heritage museum houses. 2 of the examples that I would like to give, but also to recommend to anyone who is planning to visit Mosul and immerse himself in this enchanting history of the city. The first one is Mosul Heritage House, and the second one is the Beitna Foundation. Now, both of these heritage museum houses are mainly feeding on the passion of their founders and on the commitment, on the heartfelt dedication of their team members. So from what we witnessed, it was a very diverse young society, an activist scene that we witnessed there. All of the people involved have been really, like, with the meticulous attention to detail, have restored these houses. So the physical infrastructure of both places was partially or almost fully destroyed during the war against ISIS. So like they have had like to build a lot of stuff out from scratch to restore the facades, and then they were able to invite a lot of engagement from the surrounding communities. So, for example, both in Beitna and in the Mosul Heritage House, you would have like locals that have donated certain symbolic vintage objects, artifacts. So you can visit different rooms where you find displayed sewing machines, banknotes, newspapers from Ottoman times, like to the times of Iraq's monarchy. Then in the Mosul Heritage House, there was an element with a very innovative technology, which allows you to do a visual tour of the Nuri Mosque the way it was before. Then again, you have beautifully recreated traditional Maslawi living spaces where you can sit and really imagine like how life was for your ancestors, for your grandparents, like how were they used to convene, to interact with each other. And then again, like you had this attempt to look beyond the city to also collect artifacts or miniature statues of certain emblematic like heritage sites of different communities from the very diverse, from the very socially heterogeneous Nineveh province. So you would have like a small replica of the Yazidi Lalish type, you would have a replica of Hatra, of this historical monumental city in Iraq's history. In Beitna, you would see on the walls the portraits of different Iraqi figures, writers, activists, politicians, even the famous Iraqi favorite Iraqi architect of mine, Zaha Hadid. So as you see, like with all of these interventions, the theory of change there was to foster pride, like to bring different communities together so that they don't end up discussing, okay, what was the impact of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship on your community or on your family, or what has been the impact of the sectarian war on your community or on my community, but they rather like come together and they start to connect with each other like over these shared topics. There are different playful elements, such for example, in Betna, you could even immerse yourself in this Ottoman atmosphere with by putting on traditional Maslawi clothes, taking pictures, going on the terrace, having some traditional refreshments served by traditionally dressed Maslawis from the community. So as you see, like this form of post-conflict recovery is made for the local people, but also by the people. And another, I would say, like very beneficial side effect that goes far beyond the province is that you already have interest and like you have people, visitors from the southern provinces, like from Basra, who would travel and come and like see like the Mosul heritage, and then they end up in conversations with people from Mosul who then again like develop their own interest in the culture in Basra. So you see the potential for a lot of cross-pollination, and I think like by really investing more resources, dedicating more attention to like those shared sources of pride, you stand a better chance to have a more cohesive, like national cross-sect, like cross-ethnic narrative of Iraqi history. The second example are so-called grassroots-led, again, community centers. One of the centers that we were able to visit was, again, like nestled in one of those beautifully reconstructed heritage houses. The organization's name was Volunteer With Us. And we were amazed by the diversity of the different engagements, by the different activities, by like this energy that the place could generate for people to really come and donate not only their time, but also their skills. And what we witnessed like goes from heritage promotion to environmental issues, awareness raising about the nature of community organizing, and also giving all of these communities a sense of agency, a sense of ownership, a sense of being heard, that together they can make some kind of difference, and that together they stand also a better chance like to push for collective action to resolve some of their shared grievances. Last but not least, because I want to leave more time for questions, here I want to talk about best practices in the very controversial field of peace building, reconciliation. Now, actually, both of those terms are very problematic in the Iraqi context, as we learned. First, because in some cases, the actors that are sometimes involved, tribal actors, clerics, when they speak on these topics, it already sounds like something very cosmetic, like something very superficial, because it does not really reflect like the way they speak and also the way they engage with local communities. Another example is this perception of peace building being more a marketplace, a bazaar, inviting a lot of corrupt practices rather than something like really designed to improve the situation of conflict affected communities. So what we've learned like by these local practitioners is to start low, to avoid having or even communicating like very ambitious expectations to what such a project can actually achieve, with very limited project-oriented funding, right? This was another major criticism directed at international organizations, that the type of funding is very often restricted to a specific project intervention to 6 months, instead of having real institutional funding that would strengthen the organizations and not just like create more work for them with financial reporting or reporting of different activities. So what those actors advocate for is to rather look at this type of work as conflict management rather than reconciliation. Reconciliation is also in the Iraqi context a very controversial term because different ruling elites have made use of the term, you know, like to expand their own patronage networks, to position themselves as important power brokers. So in order to convince these communities to participate in such projects, those practitioners always try like to bring them together, not around a very divisive issue. Like, for example, when you bring together people from Yazidi communities or from Arab tribes from Sinjar, you would not necessarily start like with the period of ISIS and the atrocities that had happened and the destruction of trust between the communities. But you would start with a topic where they both have an interest that something tangible happens on the ground. Like, for example, one village having better access to water resources, another village having better access to health services, and then like create a kind of an exchange, a very pragmatic exchange around those topics until the people really develop more trust vis-a-vis each other and try sharing more of like their conflicted history and also their victimhood. So those are the three examples. If we can now jump to the next slide. Here you can see on the left side, it's a picture of the Beitna Cultural Foundation. On the right side, you can see those reimagined traditional living spaces of Maslawi society. And the following quote is very important to understand how these cultural entrepreneurs act in the local context. Through our work, we hope to send a message of peace and strength. It's crucial for Iraqis to recognize their impressive past and history, which will motivate them to continue this legacy and strive to help our country. So this is a message for us, a sobering message for us, an insight, a wake-up call, not to treat these beautiful initiatives as escapism, accusing them of steering away from controversial topics, but there is a long-term vision behind them. And this is that when the past has been so painful, when you are really feeling traumatized by mentally even reliving the episodes like which you have witnessed or which your friends have been telling you or sharing with you, then you need a different self-esteem, you need a different strength, you need a different, to again, like bring the word in context, resilience, to be able to confront this past. So the theory of change behind like all of those best practices is basically like giving these conflict affected communities a sense of pride in how things used to be, in something that does not come out of a fairy tale, but comes from their own history books, and from there developing the self-esteem to confront whatever like has befallen their city or like has brought them on a confrontational path like with their ethnic or sectarian other. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Ina, I really want to also echo your statement that like these cultural initiatives should not be seen as like stealing attention from, but also as a huge resource to rethinking the past and making your way to the future. Regarding our best practices, I would say that as a stabilization international program, we try to give the more resources to local, not only governmental institution, but first people in communities. And in that soft components of reconstruction during the war, as memory work, memorialization, and identity issues, we believe that giving the resources to community level, to people on the grassroots level, is the best investment, because there are a lot of creative energy and driving force, not only to survive but also to develop. And basically, that's the people in the community in Kharkiv, in Sumy and Chernihiv region who are dealing with the everyday consequences of war, preservation of the heritage sites, and basically learning the history of local community, their own native cities and villages. So we diversified our approach and instruments, and first support the local initiatives that rethinking and rekindling the heritage of the frontline regions. And it's not only focusing on the heritage sites like big museums or monuments, but also like local history museums, cultural houses. And for example, in northern, well, all over Ukraine, there are a lot of houses of prominent cultural figures of the past, of the 20th century, 19th century, and usually people do not pay attention to the cultural figures that were living in the community, and they were actually refresh this interest to the history of their own villages, and rethinking how this local cultural and heritage sites can be rethought is one of the focus areas of PFRU's work. Also, we support initiatives, grassroots initiatives about that focuses on the storytelling and telling the stories about people's different experiences of living through war, about people's stories of getting returning to Ukraine after the full-scale invasion. We have like one project that highlighting the stories of Ukrainians who were living successfully and happily abroad before the full-scale invasion for years, and then they decided to get back to their small village somewhere in the rural Ukraine to support people and to support each other, because that was something that their identity is set to do them. Yeah, so a lot of media content is being created and document on the community level. Yeah, and on the national level, PFRU is working with the more to support the development of these grassroots cultural and heritage institutions. So can we go to the next slide just to illustrate all of the summary? So we basically designed the capacity building program standing on the shoulders of 4 big regional cultural institutions of Ukraine, like Art Arsenal, like Literature Museum in Kharkiv, like Museum in Odessa that I was speaking about, and the Cultural Fund Isolation from Donetsk region, but now evacuated to Kyiv since 2014. So we are standing on these shoulders of big cultural institutions who are producing census and are capable to support smaller ones. And now we actually selecting 30 cultural institutions across our focus areas on the north, east, and south, and do this multi-layered intervention to support locals with the knowledge, skills, and capacity of stronger ones. And that's how we giving this local ownership to local people who are the best experts in the identity reshaping and rethinking, because still memorialization in Ukraine, it's not an instrument. I would say it's a process that we are developing and witnessing currently. And just to well, so we do a lot of like museum-based work, but also we we support initiatives that repurposing the old Soviet cultural infrastructure, because almost every village has this like house of culture that can be sorts of community centers, and not all that were developed but in the Soviet times should be banned. And a lot of professionals from the cultural field saying that we can repurpose and this old infrastructure and use it in the new way. And this also will be contributing to rethinking the past and building something new in the times of war. And just to finish my summary, I would like to illustrate, to highlight one illustrative example. Next, please. So this is the man who is probably known to all Ukrainians, but for our audience, this is the Baroque philosopher Grigory Skovoroda, who was originally from Kharkiv, and he was been appropriated by the Russian cultural narrative. And the project that originated in Kharkiv and that we supported as a program, next one, is basically about reinventing and rediscovering Ukrainian heritage by Ukrainians per se. So this is the museum/house of Grigory Skovoroda in small village in Kharkiv region that was targeted by Russian shellings, and now it's destroyed. The only thing that you can do in the times of war to at least save it, you can conserve it. There is no point in rebuilding it, bearing in mind that it's only 20 kilometers from the Russian border. And that was like a huge tragedy for people in community, that this house were destroyed. Next, please. And the Literature Museum from Kharkiv actually thought about how can we reconnect with the Baroque philosopher from 16th century, Skovoroda, and his perspective of what happiness is, how the democracy and diversity works. Yeah, that surprisingly was the topics of his philosophy texts, and that's the quotation of Skovoroda, to each town its manners and rights, and that became a motto and the starting point of the music album created by Ukrainian musicians with Ukrainian authors of poetry, and they took old texts of the philosopher, created the music for that, and rethink the philosophy of being diverse, but in being inclusive, that originated in the 15th, 16th century. And this album became like big success with a big coverage of people that resonated all over in the communities all over Ukraine. And that's actually a good example. How can you work and engage with the heritage when you cannot reconstruct the physical objects, but you can still refer and lead the dialogue and re-explore, rediscover your own history. So that's the insights from what's been possible during active war. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Olga and Inna, for excellent presentations, really thoughtful and interesting and encompassing, looking at memory, heritage, reconstruction, and the challenge of post-war conflict and context. What I want to do, there's a number of questions here, and before people disappear off the call, I just want to run through them, and perhaps then you can respond. Some of them will have similar themes, but rather than taking them one at a time, I think it'll be useful. I'll just run through the questions that people have asked, and then you can choose to respond. So one of the first ones asks about militaristic mandates and actions by international institutions, whether Western military culture actually inhibits social reconstruction. And I think perhaps maybe we could more broadly talk about military culture and how that has an impact on heritage reconstruction. And then secondly, there's a question, should the international community's role be to support grassroots projects, or do they have value in running their own projects? So this idea of parallel, or whether it really needs to be collaborative. We have a question from Mohammed about structural reform and whether it needs to go hand in hand with post-war reconstruction. What are the barriers to reform in Ukraine? What lessons can Iraq share in this aspect? And to what extent are these barriers hindering resilience building in both Iraq and Ukraine? And there's another question, again, looking at the international component, particularly NATO, and what sort of impact that has on the development process in NATO have failed in a sort of comprehensive approach, as they say, in Ukraine. And then finally, within the context of Ukraine, where conflict, attrition, and destruction of infrastructure is ongoing, what happens when previous memorialization is destroyed, previous war memorials, cemeteries? Can destroyed memorials be rememorialized effectively? So the idea of what past we actually remember. So yeah, so maybe Olga and Emma, you could respond to some of those questions.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. It's actually very interesting and aptly put questions from the audience. I have like 2 comments just for sake of time. So militarization during the acute war is inevitable, and this, of course, can correspond with preserving heritage, both material and not material in Ukraine. And that's actually what's happening right now. So the situation is that on the front line, there is, and cities that close to the front line, it's the demands are not aligned with the reconstruction or paying a lot of attention to rebuilding the destructed heritage site. At the same, in rear, there are some needs to new creative approach of rebuilding and rethinking the heritage site, together with the collections of the museums that was never revised after the Soviet rule. That's the first comment. And regarding the structural reform, I think that during the it's very peculiar situation in Ukraine that even with the ongoing war, the government launching steady reforms, as well as like we continue an anti-corruption reform, judicial reform, and there are like stages of the decentralization reform that is now working. So I don't think that there are like major constraints, but with that only thing that during the acute stage of war, it's really hard to prioritize like cultural sector reform. It's still ongoing, like support to big cultural state funds, like Ukrainian culture funds, new development of the new policies. It's still ongoing. However, it's hard to incentivize government and to find resources to support the cultural reform at the time being.
Ina, would you like to respond
Yeah,
to some of these?
absolutely. I would also like to take two of the questions. The first one about having parallel international and local led initiatives, and the second one about structural reform. So on the first one, despite my personal bias and let's say a huge admiration for whatever I've seen as locally led efforts on the ground, I would say it would depend on the project. Like what kind of expertise is there on the ground? What kind of material resources would the international player bring to the table, and what kind of know-how? Now, I would still like to give one example. If it comes to updating certain old structures to the challenges of climate change, for example, if we need innovative techniques, how to have more modern living spaces for the people in Mosul, especially when it comes to restoring the built environment in the city. You have enormous Western expertise and enormous resources to do internationally led like projects. But we should not forget that there is a lot of local knowledge that does not necessarily come from, let's say, an Iraqi architect that had studied somewhere in the West, but like really local knowledge in terms of how things were done in the past. Like how can, for example, an internal courtyard be used to ventilate, you know, in order to provide a more favorable climate for the inhabitants in the house. So I naturally think that in all of these projects, regardless if it's about improving physical infrastructure, if it's about peace building initiatives, there is always huge benefits in learning and accommodating and incorporating the knowledge of local communities. Because you can have like the most experienced, let's say, practitioner in the field of peace building that has been deployed somewhere, let's say in the context of South Sudan. But you cannot just come and translate these learnings to an Iraqi context. You would always need an Iraqi counterpart. And by an Iraqi counterpart, I really mean like not necessarily just an Iraqi, but a person from this specific community who understands these underlying tensions, dynamics, like the whole prehistory between one tribe and the other. So yes, I am more in favor of always combining the international and the local dimension instead of them like going into separate tracks. As for the question of structural reform, I may have a more provocative answer. Based on my experiences in Iraq, and not just in Iraq, but in the Middle East, you should not just be doing reform for the sake of reform. We also have witnessed a lot of examples where you also do transparency-led and accountability-led like projects just for the sake of mimicking accountability. Now, what does this entail? This entails in most of the cases, the establishment of a commission, some kind of lejna, and then a couple of people that are being hand-selected by certain officials who want to expand their patronage network, and they sit together and they devise a document. The document might be even like really strong. It might in a way replicate certain UNDP or like Western principles of reforming and governing and doing good governance. But it doesn't really mean that whatever this commission has developed or decided or designed would really affect or change the way things are being done on the ground. Now, like the reform that I think is really beneficial in such post-conflict societies is really going the other way around, looking at what can be improved in the supply chain, in the chain of communication, in the chain of command, in coordination between, let's say, the municipality, the responsible agency in Baghdad, the international counterparts from whatever like big international organization we have there, and the local practitioners on the ground, and maybe ideally like the tribes and the clerics. And then if you discover like one element that really works and can improve the communication, can improve the transfer of knowledge, of resources, whatever you need in this case, then you can institutionalize it. You can formalize it and then bring it back like to the policy to be then like rubber stamped by whoever responsible elite you have in Baghdad. But this is the way that would rather work, rather than designing something that's just there like for the sake of getting like compliments from one Western partners, and then like having nothing changing on the ground.
Thank you. Just one final question, and it's perhaps a challenging one from Mehmet. And he says, based on historical commonalities between Russia and Ukraine, can memory and heritage be a tool for post-conflict reconciliation? I suppose that could also be broadened in the Iraqi context. Can heritage bring together warring communities?
Thank you. I would quickly crack on this. I think that now it's very special time for Ukrainians and also for the Global South and the Western partners in facing the very deep and fundamental process of understanding the colonial character of the war. And it's very important to broaden our epistemological lens and pay attention to the locals and to people who were oppressed. And I'm not only talking about, this can be relevant, like this question, thank you, Mahmoud, is relevant also for other post-Soviet countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan and other republics that are now independent or not independent. And we talking about commonalities in the history, commonalities are not always should define the future. And if we pay attention to the grassroots processes, to organic processes in Ukrainian society, I think it's really, really important to do this like discourse analysis of the discussions that are happening in Ukraine on the grassroots level. It's people using the first principle, nothing for us without us. And I really enjoying the critical discussion within the country, and with also other post-Soviet Republic scientists. For example, Botokoska Sembekova, who is now in one of the university in Switzerland, she's starting this scientific working group on the decolonization of the Eastern European and Central Asian studies. And that's very important processes. So it's very, very deeply rooted in the paradigm of the research and analysis that we are doing in terms of like memorialization and heritage. Of course, and now rethinking critically what are these commonalities in the history of Ukraine and Russian Empire, Soviet Union. It's really critical to understand it from the perspective of the colonized nations. And that gives a lot of answers to how the heritage can be rethinked and how it can work for the future reconciliation and dealing with the past procedures. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Olga and Inna. I think we will end our webinar there. Again, thank you for excellent contributions, really thought-provoking, and thank the audience for your questions. This webinar has been brought by XCEPT Research Project, ICSR, and the Department of War Studies. Thank you.